Friends, I'm so excited about who we get to talk to today. I'm sitting here with my new friend, Beth Allison Barr, someone who I have looked up to and followed for a long time now. And I'm so excited about this conversation. Beth, thank you so much for being here.
It's so fun to be here too. Thanks for inviting me.
For women who aren't familiar with your work yet, can you tell us who you are, what you do, and I'd love to hear a fun fact about you.
Sure. So I am actually a medieval historian. I thought that would be a fun fact, but my husband told me that wasn't actually very cool. So I had to come up with a new fun fact. So I put it in connection with being a medieval historian. And that is I teach study abroad programs pretty regularly at Baylor. And one of the classes I teach is called Castles. And so I spend summers taking students to castles, which is one of my favorite parts of my job. It's so much fun. And so I think that's really cool. And he agreed that that probably was a cool fact. So I teach castles. We can talk about that too.
We didn't talk about this beforehand, but I'm living in Spain right now. I'm from Colorado, lived in Nashville the last 10 years, but my family and I are living in Spain. And it's because of a study abroad program, like back when I was in college. And I am now, like, as you're talking, I'm going, okay, so I need to figure out where her next castle stop is going to be and like invite myself. So that was what was happening in my head. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And you have a lot of castles that you can go to in Spain as well. So that's a whole thing.
I'm going to need
a whole thing.
I think the medieval historian, I hate to disagree with your husband right off the bat, but that also is a very cool fun fact. But that's so cool. Okay, so tell us for women who don't know, you teach at Baylor. Like,
yes.
Give us your professional spiel.
Yeah. So I'm the James Vardaman Professor at Baylor University in the History Department, where I've taught for longer than I want to admit. But I have my PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in medieval history and women's history. And I teach primarily classes on women's history and church history in mostly the medieval and the early modern world. I also teach classes on women's suffrage, which is becoming more and more important now. That's another fun class I teach in London. I teach suffrage in London, which is super fun. But
I again just invited myself. So just get ready for there are going to be some emails after this. Can I please come?
I love teaching that class in London. And I wrote a book. I mean, honestly, my academic area of research, if I could admit this, is 15th century sermons. I read a lot of sermons and do pastoral care of women in the 15th century. But I wrote a book in 2021 called The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. And I think that's where most people know me from, is that book.
Oh, man. I truly am so honored to get to talk to you about this because I'm like, I just am so, I feel like we're sitting here with such a deep well of knowledge. And that's how I felt. I read your book a handful of years ago. And like, I could probably read it 4 more times and still still be getting new things out of it because I learned so much. And I feel like it was made very clear to me how much I didn't know. And so I want to, like, in this conversation, I told you this beforehand, I didn't grow up in the church. So, I like Christmas and Easter, but like, I don't have any of the growing up in church, like cultural stuff. So I really didn't know for the longest time that women like sort of weren't invited when it came to the church. And I didn't know that until I was kind of like preaching and teaching myself, after I worked in women's ministry. And then, I've been invited to speak all kinds of places and I've been welcomed, thank goodness. But it was through those, like, as I'm out in the world, kind of being a person who's sharing about Jesus and teaching about God, like from stages, I'm going, wait a minute, I'm not supposed to be up here? Like, I really didn't know. And then kind of once I found out, I started to hear, oh, no. There are a lot of people who really, really don't think that women should be doing this or a whole bunch of other things. And I feel like when I entered the church, all of that stuff was just sort of waiting for me. Like, okay, here it is. Like, put on the outfit. So I want it. And I know the women listening are in a bunch of different places. Maybe you guys listening, maybe some of the stuff we talk about is going to be a surprise to you. I think a lot of women, especially if you've spent time church adjacent, you're going to go like, I didn't even know we could talk about this. Like, let alone question it, let alone the fact that some of this stuff might not be true. So one of the things that I was so fascinated by at the beginning of your book was your story about
Yeah.
this. Can you tell us, like, what does this look like for you?
Yeah. So I grew up in small town Texas. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, which, even if you're not part of the church in the US, you've probably heard about the Southern Baptist Convention. It's been in the news quite a bit lately and probably will continue to be so. But I grew up in a small town Southern Baptist church. I grew up at a time when ideas about women in the church were actually shifting. And I wasn't aware of it until much later. But what was happening was, as I grew up in the church in the 80s and the 90s, is that this culture of women being able to serve in the church, being able to be ordained, being able to be female pastors, etc., was moving to a model where women were not allowed to do these things. And in fact, it was argued that if women pursued ministry as an independent ordained pastor or preacher or even teacher of men within the church, that was outside of God's will, and that was actually against what the Bible taught. And so we see the growth of this theology that I went head on against in the Making of Biblical Womanhood, that is called biblical womanhood. And it is this idea that God created women to follow the leadership of men, and that this carries out into all sorts of aspects of life. And so this theology was emerging as I was growing up and moving into college. And I ended up marrying a Southern Baptist pastor, who also had grown up in the Southern Baptist Church. But as I said, this theology was shifting across it was becoming more entrenched within the Southern Baptist world. And as we got married, we started graduate school 10 days after we got married. Him at a Southern Baptist seminary in North Carolina, me at Chapel Hill in a medieval history and women's studies program. So you talk about just completely different worlds here. And the seminary he was at the time, the president was Paige Patterson, and Paige Patterson was one of the engineers of the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention, and one of the main instigators of this biblical womanhood theology. So my husband's there, I'm at Chapel Hill in a very different type of program. And essentially I have this story of being an academic as well as being in a church that's becoming increasingly conservative. Yet me as a historian knows that this is a change in the church, and that this has not always been the way that women have been taught. And so the Making of Biblical Womanhood emerged from that story. We had a crisis in my life in 2016, with a lot of other crises in the world, but my husband was fired from the evangelical church we were at. And the triggering factor was him standing up for women to be able to teach Sunday school, which is just crazy, just absolutely crazy. And I wrote The Making of Biblical Womanhood in the aftermath of that, not for a few more years. It took a while for things to settle. And then my most recent book, which is coming out soon, which is a companion to The Making of Biblical Womanhood, also grew out of this and takes head on the issue of women's ordination.
You were supposed to teach a Bible study class for high schooler? Am I remembering this story
Yeah.
correctly?
So it wasn't actually about me. It was actually because at that point in time, I told my husband, I was like, I can't do this. I can't teach in a church. I can't do this at all. And I just stepped out. And he was looking for another Sunday school teacher. We couldn't find anyone who would do it. And finally, we found this one man who said he would do it if he could co-teach. And so the only other co-teacher we could find was a woman. And so we asked for her to be able to be a co-teacher with him in the Sunday school. And that was the triggering factor that led to my husband being fired literally 3 weeks later.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's great. And it was high school. It was high school kids.
Um, I just feel like we got to pause there for a second.
Yeah.
for women who have been fortunate enough to be like, what are we talking about here? Like,
Right.
what is biblical womanhood?
Yeah.
And you said Patterson.
Paige Patterson. Yeah.
Yeah. Describe for us the ideal
Yeah.
biblical woman doll.
Yeah. The ideal biblical woman is a woman who gets married and who supports and who centers her life around her husband's job and or ministry, and focuses and puts the things in her life, like if she feels called to be, she has a career, if she's teaching or something, whatever, et cetera, she's doing, that she can do those things as long as they are secondary and her primary focus is on her husband and her family. And so she is the one who keeps the house, who usually is the primary domestic engineer, if you want to use that. She takes care of the house, she cooks the food, she manages the children, and her husband is the primary breadwinner. And so it is, and this ideal is not just something that they argue makes the family run better, but it is actually the calling that God has given for women, that women are called to support and submit to their husbands. So with this role too is this idea that the husband is the primary decision maker in the home. And often the example that some of your listeners might have heard before is that usually people make decisions together, but there often comes down if there is not a consensus, there has to be a tiebreaker, and the tiebreaker is always the husband. And that's the way it's explained.
To add on to this, I'm wondering, is there something connected to this about like how women should behave, how women
Yes.
should dress?
Yep. Oh gosh, yeah. Yes. So this is the core theology is this idea that women are called by God to submit to men. Mostly their husbands, but it plays out beyond that. And that they are called to be primarily wives. And there is a whole narrative that says, yes, of course, single women are important, but it's always a secondary sort of thing. It's like if you can't find a husband, then yeah, you can still be good in God's eyes, but really the primary calling is to be married and to have kids. That's it. And so with this too is also this idea that a woman is to be attractive to her husband and is to help fulfill his needs, etc. But you also, and to do this, you have to keep yourself pure before marriage. This is the whole purity culture thing. And that you are called to protect your future husband as, somebody growing up. You're to protect your future husband from falling into sexual sin by dressing modestly. I remember the t-shirts in the early 2000s that said modest is hottest, and those types of things. I remember kids in our youth group wearing those. And this idea that, a lot of the church camps that we would go to wouldn't allow women to wear bikinis or to wear swimsuits that weren't one pieces, and you couldn't wear strapless tank tops. You couldn't wear spaghetti strap tank tops or anything, certainly not strapless, but because they might show bra straps, and bra straps would show that you were wearing bras, which would draw attention to your breasts, which would somehow cause men to sin. A lot of attention. You could think about people who maybe go to schools with dress codes that girls have to have the credit card where their shorts and their skirts have to be no more than a credit card length above their knees. And I just had a student in my office this last semester telling me stories about where she was credit carded often and how just, shame that was to be pulled out of class because your skirt was deemed to be too short.
Mhm.
And these feelings of shame, this cause women that there's something wrong with our bodies. But this is all connected to this idea that we should center our lives around men and that men are entitled to enjoy women's bodies, and women have the responsibility to make sure that their husbands stay within the home to do that. So in some ways, there's also this burden put on women that if your husband's unfaithful, it's because you're not doing it right at home. And which is just, it's this horrific teaching but it has become such a common narrative within the church. And I'm biting my tongue, trying not to say in the name of a young woman who has spoken on campus at Baylor before, who has just written a book, which I call Purity Culture 2.0, which has become very, very popular, that pretty much just promulgates this entire theology for a whole new generation. And it's terrifying and infuriating and makes me so sad what we have done to women in the church.
This is like a whole spinoff, but I want to mention it. Sheila Ray Gregoire, who I'm sure
Yes,
you
I know her
know,
well.
she has been on the show before, but she's been doing a ton of work about like what happens in our sex lives as
Yes.
for specifically for women, but within couples as well, when this is the theology. Like how the damage that's caused by putting the burden on a woman of saying like you are responsible for your husband not sinning, you are his
Yes.
anti-porn, you're his anti
Yes.
unfaithfulness, you're his release, you're his like all these different I mean, they're her books, I have devoured them and I'm like, what? Oh my, so her work is incredible and talks
Yeah.
about like that piece of it a lot.
And I can give you an example actually from my most recent book research in the Pastor's Wife book. I talk a lot about Paige Patterson's wife, Dorothy Patterson, who helped set in motion a lot of these classes for pastors' wives, and in some ways, the pastor's wife is the ideal. She's the personification of biblical womanhood. She is the perfect. She is the exemplar of what a biblical woman should be in these evangelical spaces. And Dorothy Patterson taught her how she is supposed to act. And one of the things that Dorothy Patterson taught in her classes, and I heard this from person after person, was that she taught women that male sexuality and male satisfaction in sex was actually more important than women's, because women could produce children without being sexually satisfied, without having an orgasm. Can I say that?
It's girls' time.
Whereas,
Yes, you
okay,
can.
okay, I can say that. But men, can, they orgasm regardless of whether or not it produces a child or not. And so this idea that what's more important is for that male, that God put more priority on men being sexually satisfied than women. So that's not a priority for wives. The priority for wives is to be there for that satisfaction of their husbands. And I mean, that's just a terrible message that sets up so much failure for young married couples. And then, and this is coupled with the whole thing that women are supposed to be completely chaste and virtuous before marriage and, not have anything, not even supposed to think about sex or that sort of, and then the wedding night, somehow they completely flip that and become these sex goddesses, which is just impossible, this impossible standard for women.
Yeah. I have 14,000 questions, so I'm like really disciplining myself to keep it together here. I want to know too, when it comes to like teaching and leading in the church for women who don't know what like those rules are. And I don't know that I mean, I could probably define them, but I would love a sort of,
Yes.
as a biblical woman, this is what you're allowed to do in church and this is what you're definitely not allowed to do.
Yeah, well, so let me give you the broad parameters. The broad parameter is mostly centered in 1 Timothy 2. And the verse there in 1 Timothy 2, 14 through 15 is that women are not supposed to teach or have authority over men, is the way that verse is interpreted, okay? And so taken from that, extrapolated from that verse, is this idea that women can't have any teaching roles in the church that exercise authority over men, which can be preaching all the way down to teaching high school Sunday school, because the idea is that those boys are actually men. Once it's a very weird thing that in the Judaic custom, at the age of 13, the age of 12, actually, young boys are considered to be men. And so therefore you can't teach boys who are older than 12 or 13, according to this. So which is a crazy sort of thing anyway. But this biblical idea that women aren't to teach or have authority over men. And then they couple that with what we call the household code passages, which are like Ephesians 5, which you've probably heard in a lot of marriage ceremonies that say wives are to submit to their husbands, and men are to love their wives as Christ loves the church. And so women are to submit to male authority, and women are not to have teaching authority over men. And so those are the two main places it comes from.
So this wasn't, even talking about this, I need to know if like anyone else is like, okay, so yeah, those are the rules, right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, so those are the rules. So like, what else are we going to talk about here? Like, is it possible that it's not possible that any of those could be like not hard and fast, right?
Yeah.
Because like, again, for the fact that I didn't grow up in the church, the time that I have been part of the evangelical world, like I've picked up all of that. And I have specific stories in my marriage of being like, well, Carl, you're supposed to, I mean, I guess you should make the decision because you're in charge. And he's like, no. Like, that's not, no, that's not how we're doing this.
Yeah.
It's so pervasive. So tell me first, like, this didn't used to be a thing recently. What was the shift? Like, why did they all of a sudden start to be like, hey, this should be like, that's the shift that you basically like got a front row seat to?
Yeah. So first of all, I'll say that throughout church history, women have always faced more restrictions than men. Or I don't know about restrictions. Actually, probably it's been more challenging for women to move into types of leadership roles. Mostly this is because of historical context, that women, because of laws that subordinated women, like in the legal sense, the marriage laws, et cetera. There's always been more challenges. However, this modern moment in the evangelical church, I would argue, is one of the most restrictive moments in the entirety of church history that have put more limits and restrictions on women across the board than throughout history. There have always been loopholes for women, sometimes really big loopholes. Like, for example, I'm a medieval historian, so I can tell you about a woman named Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century who actually went on preaching tours throughout Europe and preached to bishops. She wrote letters and exerted influence over the Pope, and exercised what we would consider to be major authority over men. That was surpassed the authority of pastors. And yet now today in evangelical spaces, women are told that they cannot even be teachers over men, that their teaching is restricted completely to other women and or children, which has a whole lot of other, problems. And so we've seen a much more restrictive turn. And this has been a direct product of really the post-World War II era in the Western church, and has taken a very unique conservative turn in evangelical Christianity, which has been very much rooted in the Southern culture of the U.S. And so the Southern Baptist Convention is a huge part of it.
So it's always been hard for women to be leaders because throughout basically all of history, women have not had the same rights as men.
Yes.
And so the church has like followed that.
Yes, exactly.
But something that I like to talk more about this, it's not the other way around.
Right.
It's not that women's roles have always been this because this is what God mandated.
Right.
When the Bible was being written.
Yes, that's exactly right. So one of the stories I always like to remind people of is that the very first person in the Bible who actually names God is Hagar, who is an enslaved, sexually abused woman. She's she's the servant, the slave. She's the enslaved woman of Sarai and Abram.
Yep.
And Abram takes her and essentially rapes her because Sarai says that she's not able to get pregnant to produce the promised child. And after Sarah becomes pregnant with Isaac, Hagar is beaten and she runs away. And God comes to her in the desert and gives her the same promise that he gave to Abraham and Sarah, that she would be the mother of a great nation. I mean, it's actually amazing. It's the same promise he gives him. And she names him the God who sees. And what we see through the Bible, there is a consistent narrative in the Bible of God always reaching down and seeing women despite the horrific conditions that some of these women lived in because of their culture. And so you can even think about that Jesus, that the genealogy of Jesus actually has 4 women in it, which is just really incredible because at that time, there was no reason to put those women in, especially women like Rahab, who was a prostitute. And yet she is put into the lineage of Jesus. And so we think about we see this impulse. The Bible was certainly written in patriarchal cultures, and a lot of that comes through. And there's lots of terrible things that happen to women in the Bible. We do have the household codes that very much parallel Roman culture, which says women are subordinate. But yet at the same time, we see Paul validating, praising women for being house church leaders, which means they were essentially pastors, as well as calling women apostle, calling women deacon. And so all of the roles in the early church, which were house church leader, deacon, and apostle, women are named in all of those positions in the New Testament. And there's not a
By
problem.
Paul,
By Paul.
who's the same person that we all
Yeah.
point to and say, he said women can't talk.
It's exactly right. And so what we see in that is that we see that women in the Bible itself were serving in leadership roles. And in fact, I think it's like 12 of the 20 house churches that we know of in Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries were all named for women, half of them, which suggests to us that the leaders of those churches were actually women. And so women were significant leaders in the early church. And so it seems like, how have we bought this lie that tells us today that women cannot serve in the church because women are biblically prohibited from serving in the church, when the Bible shows us and names us women who were serving in leadership roles equivalent with men and praised by men like the Apostle Paul?
I think we'll get into that for a minute. So get into that in a minute. I want to know, so what happened after you mentioned World War II?
Yeah.
What was that shift? Why?
Yeah, sure. The first stop I would have to say would be with Reformation theology and in the 16th century. And in the 16th century, what we saw happen is women's ministry roles that were outside of marriage pretty much were subordinated, almost disappear with Reformation theology that emphasizes the significance of marriage. So we see this emphasis put that the best calling for both men and women is actually to be married. To be godly is to be married in the world after the Reformation. And that hits both women and men and helps lead to where we don't value the contributions of single people as much in the evangelical spaces.
So can you remind me, as someone who did not go to seminary and also did not take any Bible classes in school, can you remind me when the Reformation was?
Yeah. So when I talk about the medieval world, we're talking about roughly 500 to 1500. And then the Reformation, you can always, a date is 1517 with Martin Luther, and so the 16th century is where we really begin to see this shift, this emphasis on marriage. And I talk about this both in the Making of Biblical Womanhood and then also in Becoming the Pastor's Wife, where we see that to be a godly woman and to be a godly woman in ministry is to be married to a pastor. Is essentially, in some ways, the legacy of the Reformation in some ways, which had both pros and cons to it. It did elevate the role of marriage for women, which was a plus, and valued their roles as wives, which was really important and was different from the medieval world in some ways, because wives were considered to be the least important role a woman could do actually in medieval theology.
Really?
So, yes, because sex was considered to be so sinful. And so women who are regularly involved in sex, even as married women, makes them less godly than a single woman who has dedicated her life to celibacy. Celibacy is the highest Christian calling in the medieval church, which has pros and cons to it both. As I said, this isn't one is better than the other. It's just different. And then
It's
in the,
so
yeah,
like I can picture the scripture where it's like I'm like, okay, well, yeah, I can see how they could be like, if you how does Paul say it?
it's
If you're
better
going
to
to burn with
marry than
blessed.
burn.
Yes, it's better to be married than to burn. And so it's like, okay, and we all have heard that singleness is a gift. Like we're like, thanks, Paul, like keep the gift receipt. Um, but but I feel like it's so interesting that that shifted. It was totally one way,
Yeah,
then it was totally a different way.
absolutely.
And like for those of us who have felt pressure to get married and felt like this isn't just like a casual like, oh, well, I'm choosing to be friends with this person over this, but like it's not just any other relationship. It feels like the highest calling in your life, the way that people talk about
Absolutely.
it for you. And to just point out that that's been the case for 500 years.
Yeah.
So like the fact that this feels like it's in the water for us, it's in the water and it's been there for 500 years. So you're not making it up if you feel like you're feeling this pressure.
Yep, that's exactly right. And part of this is because Reformation theology defined itself in opposition to medieval Catholicism, in which the priest was unmarried. And so getting married was an act of defiance. It was in some way, and so, you know, women who chose to marry pastors in those first few hundred, really couple hundred years was actually an act of bravery. And it was, many of them lost their lives for it, especially in places like Germany. And so it was actually, these women to marry pastors was a huge deal. But what happened over time is that became not just that became the ideal for all women. That this is not only something that some brave women are doing to help put forward Protestant theology, but now this is the only thing that women should do. That's what happens. And part of this is just time, and part of this also is really the aftermath. And this was your question: what happened after World War I and World War II? And World War I and World War II were dramatic changes in Western society because so many people died. They were so horrific. They just completely shook up society. And so, in the aftermath of them, and we also think about how many women went and began to move into traditionally male spaces because all the men were dead. The First World War wiped out an entire generation of men. And it's horrific. And then the Second World War, which wasn't that long after, still wiped out so many, and there just weren't enough people to do the jobs. And so women were pulled into all of these spaces. And then when the war was over, we have all of these soldiers who have been through traumatic events who are going back home. And there begins to be a push to try to normalize things for them by getting them back into jobs that all these women are in. And so there begins to be this social call, like sort of like, hey, women, yeah, we called you to go to work, but now the thing to do is to go home and have babies and let your husband be the breadwinner. And this is not just a Christian call. This is like a cultural call that you can see throughout US society, this call for women to go back home so that men can get back enculturated in some ways back into society. And there are some good things. It was extraordinarily traumatic for so many of these men. But what happens is that a lot of these women who get pushed out of workspaces, like, for example, it was very common in the 50s and the 60s, if a woman got engaged while she was in her job, she would get fired. Because it was no longer seen as her place. If she got pregnant, she would be fired from her job. And so this made a lot of women not happy because they wanted to get married and have families, but they also wanted to do their job, the thing they felt called to work outside the home. And so we see the seeds of what becomes the second way, feminism, the rise of feminism in this period, which I assume some people have very negative connotations about. But really what feminism was trying to do was to keep women from being fired for getting married and having babies, et cetera, and being able to be equal to men and to have the same rights. Like, I tell my students, it's not until the 60s and 70s that women can take out credit cards in their own name. It's not until the 60s, Barbie, we all saw the Barbie movie. I love the Barbie movie. Barbie got her dream house before women could buy houses without having male cosigners. So, that's one of the things that was really radical, that Barbie got a dream house. And if you look at that dream house, her original dream house didn't have a kitchen. It was actually a very political statement by Barbie.
Whoa.
Yes, it was her house. There's no room for Ken either in that house. It's hers. And that was actually a direct cultural statement that women actually can't do that. Women can't buy houses on their own because they have to have male cosigners. They couldn't buy cars until the Equal Credit Act that gave women. So these are this push for women to have equal status. And this threatens male jobs. It also leads to a rise of women going to seminary, especially in women moving into wanting to be in pastoral positions. And it is at this moment that the church has really a freak out moment. I would call it a freak out moment in the late 70s and the early 80s. And they say, this is ungodly and this is unbiblical, and we have to change cultural norms and get the godly family back in place, which is women in the home, men at work. And this is the rise of this theology that we call biblical womanhood.
So is it like, I'm thinking about those verses in First Timothy, and in Ephesians, right?
Yeah, the household codes, they're Ephesians, Colossians,
Okay, yeah. I think that our fear always, because this has been preached to all of us, is like, we can't cherry pick the Bible.
Yes.
Like you change yourself to match the Bible, not the other way around. And so it sounds like maybe the verses that we pulled out were cherry picked.
Yes.
And then if you're looking at, is that the answer?
Yes. So this is how I actually got into this research, was I'm a medieval historian. I read medieval sermons. And one of the things that I began noticing was that none of these verses that we call these that have been used against women, like 1 Timothy 2 and the household codes, even 1 Corinthians 14, which I talk about in the Making of Biblical Womanhood, none of these verses are in medieval sermons. They're like extraordinarily rare. And I was like, that's fascinating. Why aren't these verses being preached in medieval sermons? And the other thing that I noticed in medieval sermons was that they use gender inclusive language. Okay, so for people who've read the Bibles that, like, for example, if you've read the passages in 1 Timothy that talk about being an elder or being a deacon, and they use all masculine pronouns. Well, that's actually not in the original languages. Those are actually gender neutral pronouns. There's only 2 times in that they're male specific. So we've made it look like to be a deacon is to be a man, but that's actually not what the biblical language shows. And in medieval sermons, I found that in verses today that we would often use only male pronouns, that medieval priests translated them gender inclusively. So they would say, instead of man, they would say man and woman, men and women. And this really stood out to me as somebody who'd grown up in the evangelical church, where I had always heard these verses that only were used masculine language. And I was like, well, this is interesting. And so I saw that, I was like, where does this actually come from? And we you can look, I mean, we see a shift in masculine language that actually, like a good example is Junia. Junia is mentioned in Romans 16 by Paul as an apostle.
Okay.
And up until the 19th century, Junia was pretty much across the board. Only a couple of exceptions was translated as a feminine name. Nobody questioned that she was a woman. In the late 19th century, around the same time of the first wave of suffrage, women trying to get the right to vote, Greek translations start translating her as masculine. And this actually continues in 20th century Bible translations. Up until relatively recently, because now they've had to backtrack on that because there is no actual scholarly justification to not translate her as a woman, because it's a feminine name. But you would see a lot of Bible translations that would actually translate her as a male. And the reason they said is because women can't be apostles. So therefore it has to be a man. That's the reasoning. And this is this is traceable. This is traceable. That we can see this shift. And it is in direct response to women moving into more leadership roles in US culture. So biblical womanhood is actually not driven by the Bible. It's driven by fears of women moving into leadership in US culture.
What is the fear?
That's a lovely question. You know, I would say two reasons for it. One of them is simple, pure economics of it, leadership. I mean, when you have more people who are moving and eligible for jobs, it's harder to get those jobs. So when you have women moving into positions that men primarily have been in, that increases competition, and that causes fear for everyone. I think we don't behave our best when we are afraid of losing our jobs, afraid of more competition in spaces. I think that was part of the fear. Part of the fear, too, stems from these ideas about women and this idea that women are supposed to, the fears about female sexuality, that women who move into workplaces are going to be more likely to not get married, to sleep around, to cause men to stumble into sin, etc. And so it's better to keep these spaces separate, to keep women in the home, safeguard their sexuality, keep men in these spaces where they're not tempted by women. In the evangelical world, we call this the Billy Graham rule, which is Billy Graham said famously that he would never, when he was traveling, he would never go to dinner or be alone with a woman who wasn't his wife. And sort of this idea that the way that you protect men from falling into sexual sin is by literally segregating them from women, because women are always temptresses. I think there's a popular pastor in my hometown who went viral a couple of years ago for giving this whole thing where he talked about him being at a restaurant with some of his friends, and that this waitress came up and was essentially tempting him to cheat on his wife. And he called her, essentially put all of the blame on her. That she was literally Satan, coming and tempting him. And it's this idea that the female body is dangerous. So I think that's part of it, is this ideas about the female body. Also, fears about what happens when women's sexuality is not controlled. Fears of competition in the workplace. I think all of these things added up together.
I feel like I need to just lay down and process for a while.
I'm sorry.
No. This is so good. I want to know, what do we do with this, and what do we do next?
Yeah.
So if we're thinking, oh my gosh, maybe this thing that I thought was true forever isn't true, or these verses that were highlighted, maybe they were cherry picked. And the greater story is different from what I've been told. Where do we go to find out more and to like explore this further. And yes, you absolutely can say, go on Amazon or to your favorite local bookstore and buy my books.
Well, you could do that. Both The Making of Biblical Womanhood and Becoming the Pastor's Wife tell this story and it's rooted very clearly in biblical history as well as church history. I think also for women, a lot of women, when they start to process this, they feel angry because of how they have been taught. And so and I think it's okay to be angry. It's perfectly fine. I have moments of lots of anger. But at the same time, I want people to know that women teach this to other women because this is what women have been taught. And so I think I think a lot of it is just women honestly trying to be faithful to what they believe is God's teachings for women. And so I think we have to be careful, not careful. I think we just have to be aware that most people aren't trying to dupe you or this is honestly what women have been taught. This is what I've read 150 pastor's wife books. This is what women were taught. This is what women have been being taught since the 1980s. This is in women's Bible studies. This is in our Bibles that are geared towards women. This is in our college class. I mean, this is it. This is what we've been taught. So it's going to take a long time to undo this. I think a first place to start for women is honestly just go back to your Bible and read it with fresh eyes. I would recommend if you're reading it through like the ESV, which is the most popular version of the Bible in the US today. I think, or second popular. The KJV may still be more popular, but it was intentionally written. It was intentionally translated to minimize women's leadership roles. And they actually say that's what it was to do. So if that's the Bible that you're using, I would suggest you don't have to throw it away or burn it, but go get an NIV or go get an NRSV and read it alongside and see the changes in how women have been portrayed. Also go through and read Romans 16. There are 10 women listed in that passage that Paul commends for being church leaders. Go read their names. Go see the jobs that they are doing. Biblical womanhood is doing what God has called you to do. And we see women in the Bible called to do everything, to be moms, to support ministry, to support the ministry of Jesus, to work independently in ministry, to be leaders like deacons and apostles and church leaders, as well as just to be missionaries. Women do all of these things. And so, it seems to me the church would be so much better if we let women serve the way God created us to serve.
Yeah. That's really when I was learning all of this, at the time, there was a long time where I wanted to go to seminary, and I thought like I want to be a pastor, and I thought I probably wanted to talk mainly to women because these are my people, and
Yes.
because I'm like something so special happens when women are together, but not because I thought that I was only allowed to do that.
Right.
And like I had to wrestle with the idea of what if actually God says I'm not supposed to teach, I'm not supposed to lead. And it never made sense to me that God would bench half his A team. Like it doesn't make any sense to me. And this is so cocky, and he can talk to me about it. But I was like, this is an area I'm really willing to get wrong. Like if I am facing God someday and he's like, hey, I didn't mean for you to tell people about me and love people and like use the gifts I'd given you. I just actually wanted you to sit there and be quiet. Like, I'm really sorry. I messed that up. That was what it came down to. And so to hear actually that maybe it's not so wrong, like that's not right after all.
Let me give you a super fast example that is one of the most powerful examples that women don't know at all. And it's actually Martha in the Bible, Martha of Bethany, which we hold as Mary and Martha. Martha is often depicted, and I talk about her in the Making of Biblical Womanhood. She's often depicted as the hostess with the mostest. She's the person who we see who cooks the dinner for Jesus, et cetera. And that's the way that this is what women are to do. Well, what always just shocks the pants off of everyone is that the word that is used to describe Martha, the work that she is doing, is not actually household chores. The word that is used to describe her is diaconia, which is the same word that's used to describe the work of the male apostles. What Martha is doing is the ministry of male apostles with Mary. And she's not living in her brother's house. She is the household head, in which Lazarus is probably a younger brother, the way that the whole thing works together. And just that little story just shows us how much we have been taught to see women in the Bible as doing something very different than they actually were. Women were serving in ministry and sharing the gospel as leaders and teachers and preachers.
This has been fantastic. I just beg you to come back. You have to come back on Girls' Night.
I'd love to come back. It's fun.
It is not optional. We must have you back. Seriously, thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for explaining it to us in such a understandable way. And I know that so many women are typing in your name right now into, again, go to your local bookstore. But I'm super excited about your new book. Tell me when it comes out again.
March 18th. So
okay.
It's getting close.
Oh, it's getting close.
Yeah.
Well, we will be on the lookout for that. And seriously, Beth, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for having me.